All right, so today we're covering obesity, and this is a very large topic. It's difficult to cover in a single lecture. People spend their entire lives studying this. So I hope that we cover some interesting points for you. Before we start, I want to ask you to do two things. So first, and this one I'd like you to put in perusal just so that you can sort of start a conversation with classmates about this before we jump into the lecture. But first, I want you to consider the question of, do you consider obesity a disease and why or why not? Then I want you to pause the video and come up with two questions for me. So if you were designing a study on obesity, what would you want to learn? And I want you to try to be specific here, right? So I don't want you to say, well, I want to know how obesity develops. Okay, what that's this massive topic. Like, what aspect about the development of obesity are you interested in? Does that relate to physical activity? And it's okay if it doesn't, but what population would you be studying? What mechanism around the development of obesity would you be interested in? What would you be measuring? What would your outcome variable be if you were doing this research study, right? So try to make your question somewhat specific. And I want you to hold those questions. So don't post them here. But I want you to hold those questions until the end and see if at some point during this lecture that question gets answered. And if not, there's going to be a chance to post those questions at the end so that one, I can maybe develop answers in lectures. Perhaps your classmates can answer, but I want you to come into lecture with those questions. Okay. So first, I cover this slide a couple of times throughout the next couple of weeks, but I think it's helpful to give you an idea of how we're going to cover disease across the semester. Diseases are interconnected, particularly when we're talking about chronic disease, and there are lots of different mechanisms that develop the or that influence the development of these different diseases. So, this is a map that I created to give you a sense for what direction we're going. No, it's ultimately much more complex than this, but it's how we'll kind of go across the semester, and it can help you think about, okay, well, where are we at in lecture right now, and how does that relate to the development of disease? So first, right, we cover the 24-hour movement patterns. So we're looking at physical activity, sleep, and sedentary time, right? Those three things have to encompass all of our movement across the day, and we're interested in how those affect the development of disease. So first, we cover sort of positive energy balance, and that's where we're at today. Positive chronic positive energy balance then contributes to dyslipidemia, which is just unhealthy levels of fat in the blood, as well as adiposopathy, which is the malfunction of fat tissue and also the accumulation of excess fat tissue. Now, adiposopathy is directly related to obesity, and it's one way in which we could theoretically be diagnosing obesity. Um, Dyslipidemia and adiposopathy combine to contribute to insulin resistance, which is diagnostic criteria for type 2 diabetes. And then dyslipidemia, insulin resistance contribute to atherosclerosis, so plaque buildup in our arteries, which is diagnostic criteria for cardiovascular disease. And then atherosclerosis and insulin resistance contribute to hypertension, so high blood pressure. And again, ultimately, hypertension, typically chronic hypertension, could lead to heart failure and renal failure. Okay, so anyway, I hope that that will help give you sort of a roadmap for where we're going over the next couple of weeks. So today we want you to be able to define obesity and discuss prevalence, incidence, and cost, explain how chronic positive energy balance leads to adipocyte or adipocyte, doesn't really matter, I guess your pronunciation, dysfunction, how that adiposopathy or malfunctioning fat tissue leads to insulin resistance, and then discuss how exercise mitigates the metabolic dysfunction with or without weight loss. So, in talking about obesity, first we have to define what it is. So, as a sort of medical and research community, we have defined obesity by BMI. And BMI is calculated as a height to weight ratio. So, it's your kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. And if we're using the metric system, right, we can look at weight times 703 and then divide that by height in inches squared. So, it's just a derivation of the kilograms per meter squared equation that's used across most of the world. And then based on what your height to weight ratio is, we have categorized you as underweight, normal weight, overweight, obese, or extremely obese. So that's how obesity is defined. But there are lots of different types of obesity. So sometimes we think obesity is one thing, but there are typically considered four different types. So monogenic obesity would be obesity that's caused by a single chromosomal mutation. Syndromic obesity is associated with other health conditions, so things like mental retardation or organ abnormalities. And the two most common types are called Prader-Willi and Bardet-Biedl. They're still very uncommon. I think you're looking at like 1 in 75,000 in the population has Bardet-Biedl, I think, or has Prader-Willi. No, has Bardet-Biedl. And then I think it's like 1 in 25,000 has Prader-Willi. So not highly prevalent relative to um, polygenic obesity. Oligogenic obesity is a small number of chromosomal mutations, and then polygenic is, right, a combination of multiple different factors contributing to the development of obesity. So, if we're defining obesity by BMI, right, it's helpful to understand how BMI is distributed across age, gender, and time. So across gender, right, we actually see pretty similar patterns between men and women. So we see BMI peaking around 60, 54 to 62, I think is what some of the research says that I threw in the slide notes for you. And then similar in men, right? And right about the age of 60, between 60 and 70, we see that start to sort of fall off a little bit. And that's relatively independent of other lifestyle factors or other demographic variables like your race, for example, here. Now, we obviously see a little bit of variation in men, not nearly as much in women, a little bit more regarding race. Then across time, what we see, and this is a little more interesting to interpret, but the different colors of lines represent different time periods. So before 1905 and then up to 1980 to 1984. And all we really want to see is, right, we saw that before 1905, okay, obesity was not as common, right? So total or the high point of BMI was earlier in life, typically. Sorry, I need a laser pointer so that that doesn't keep disappearing for us. Okay, so right, BMI wasn't reaching high levels, right? And then as we go across time, right, BMI increases, and the slope of the line also changes. So we see that the slope of the line, right, was sort of curved here, and eventually we get to this really sort of straight line. So we see that higher BMIs are occurring earlier in age, and they're increasing at a faster rate as well across time. So that then would contribute to higher prevalence of obesity in the US, particularly. So now we're looking at distribution of obesity in space and time as well here a little bit. So we do cover incidence as part of this slide. And I just wanted to quickly mention this is based on self-report height and weight, right? We covered sort of some of the issues with self-report in PA measurement, but also some of the benefits. So remember that if you're covering a huge population, self-report is probably what we're going to use because it's the most feasible option. So what we see in the US is that obesity is not evenly distributed across the US, right? So you see those states that are darker reds, right? That indicates a higher level of prevalence. Um, it's also not evenly distributed internationally. So what we see is, right, the US has one of the higher rates of obesity. And across the world, about 3.4 million people die every year due to overweight and obesity. But the US has one of the highest rates across all countries. So we also talked about weight, right? The US spends more per capita on healthcare than any other country. Well, if your population is 31% obese, and we're going to look at that number in just a second here, right? Relative to, let's say, if we're comparing us to, it's common to compare the US to European Union countries, right? If we're comparing us to Austria, well, Austria's population is 9% obese, so they're not dealing with the complications of obesity nearly to the same extent that the US is. And in actuality, so this is 2017 data. In actuality, the prevalence of obesity in the US is peaking right now at about 42% of the US is considered obese. And an additional about 30% of the US is considered overweight. So we have really really high prevalence, and that's pretty common. Or like we saw earlier, it's pretty similar between men and women, and also across age groups, with a little drop earlier in life, right? That 20 to 39 category, and then a little drop sometimes in that 60 and over category as well. Um, Okay, we have seen the prevalence of obesity in the US increase dramatically across time, right? So if we look back just to the 1999 to 2000, right, prevalence of obesity was 30%. Now it's 42.4%. So about a what 35, 36% increase in the prevalence of obesity across that time frame, and then about a 50% increase in the prevalence of severe obesity across that same time frame. Globally, when we look, there's a comparison in your slide notes about between 1975 and 2014. So global prevalence increased from, and they differentiate between men and women here, but from 3.2% in men to 10.8% in men in 2014, and then from 6.4% to 14.9% in women globally. So since about 1980, prevalence has doubled in over 70 countries. So this is, yes, the US is dealing with it maybe more than other countries are, but this is a what we would consider an epidemic, right? This is happening. Significant increases in prevalence are happening across the globe. Now, prevalence could be increasing just because people are living longer, right? So, if you have obesity and you're not dying, then more people are going to be, right? Incidence is still continuing. So more people are going to be developing obesity and living with obesity. Therefore, right, we're going to see increased prevalence. So that could be indicative of longer lifespans with obesity. Or there could be more cases, right? We could be seeing an increase in the incidence of obesity. So I have that data here for you. And right, what we see, so if we take, this is cases per 1,000 person years. Also, it's really hard to find this data, by the way, because it's hard to study incidence, right? This is longitudinal data now. So we had to follow people across time and see what development looks like. So what we see, right, in all of the figures is that incidence sort of peaks a little bit earlier, right? Which makes sense because it's it's not um, abundantly common for someone to become obese and then to uh, have recurrence of obesity or remission of obesity, right? Often, once you're obese, you're not going back to being not obese. And we're going to talk about that throughout this lecture, right? So it makes sense that we would see higher incidence actually at younger ages, and then we see that sort of taper off. Okay. You also see higher incidence among, and this is US data, so Black Americans as opposed to white Americans. Um, you also see higher incidence among adults with overweight compared to adults with normal weight. So you're right, your risk for being obese if you are overweight is higher than if your risk is than if your weight is considered normal, which also makes sense. And this is really, this D figure is the one that I think is most interesting. So what we see is, right, this is now looking across time again. How is incidence changing across time? And what we see is that it was actually pretty stable from about 2000 to 2013. But from 2013 to 2017, we did see an increased incidence, especially in these younger populations. Okay. So with that as a backdrop, also, I just wanted to say that in terms of classifying obesity, so we see how prevalence have changed, we see how incidence has changed. The World Health Organization classified obesity as a disease in 1948. The NIH declared an epidemic, right, which we just talked about, in 1997. The American Medical Association declared it a disease in 2013. So whether or not you think it's a disease, that's up to you, right? But I wanted you to give some historical context for how sort of global organizations are talking about and classifying obesity. With that, just a quick side note, but something to think about is why would it be important to label it a disease? And one of the reasons would be insurance in the US. So if it is a disease, insurance may cover specific treatments, whereas if it's not considered a disease, insurance isn't going to cover specific treatments. So that's one aspect of our particular healthcare system that is interesting to navigate and important to consider when we decide whether or not something is a disease. So lastly, in terms of, right, when we're studying epidemiology, right, we want to study the distribution and determinants of disease or health outcomes in populations, right? This is again a distribution slide. So how is it distributed across different races? And what we see is that when we compare different races, we see really different patterns. So non-Hispanic Black adults and non-Hispanic American Indian or Alaska Native adults um, have much higher prevalence, generally speaking, as do Hispanic adults when compared to non-Hispanic white adults, as well as non-Hispanic Asian adults. Um, so when we look at what the numbers are, right, we already covered that the prevalence of obesity is 42.2% in the uh, actually, that was general population. I don't think that was white only, but in this graph, it's not in the non-Hispanic white population, right? We see higher prevalence in the non-Hispanic Black population, lower in the non-Hispanic Asian population, and then higher in the Hispanic population. Okay, so and that's similar trends for uh, women. For men, right, we see actually a slight drop in the prevalence for the non-Hispanic Black population. Okay. So why do we care, right? Why does a height to weight ratio matter? So if you are considered overweight, and we're just looking at mortality here as the health outcome, if we look at hazard ratios for unhealthy weight, the hazard ratio for adults who are considered class 1 obese, so a BMI of 30 to 35, have a hazard ratio of 1.45. You should know how to interpret that number at this point, but that indicates that there's a 45% increased risk of death in adults classified as obese compared to adults classified as normal weight based on BMI. What's interesting, and I've covered some of this in your slide notes, but is that actually in older adults we don't see that same association. So in older adults, um, the hazard ratio of um, obese individuals is not significantly different from normal weight individuals. So pretty interesting there. In class 2 and class 3 obesity, though, across the age spectrum, we see increases in risk. So a 94% increase in risk for individuals classified as class 2 obese, and then a 176% increase in mortality for individuals classified as morbidly obese or class 3 obese. Um, so that's just if we're looking at mortality as a health outcome. If there are other issues, right, with having overweight or obesity. So we have cardiovascular disease or dyslipidemia, right? Issues with regulating lipids in our blood, hypertension, type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, gallbladder disease, osteoarthritis, some cancers, and death. And we will look at some of the hazard ratios in these specific diseases as well and their association with obesity and with physical activity later in the semester. Um, in any case, when we're looking at the associations between overweight and obesity and mortality, what we see is that it's more impactful in younger individuals and in men. But what was interesting, coming back to self-report, is that when individuals were measured by an interviewer or a researcher, right, as compared to self-report data, there was no difference, right? So when we compare results from those studies, there isn't a difference. So here, that would incline me then to believe that, okay, I can confidently use self-report data for BMI with individuals and trust their responses. Um, With overweight specifically, sorry, these are the hazard ratios for obese, so BMI greater than 30. With overweight, BMI is not associated with increased mortality. Sorry, so I should have been more clear about that from the beginning. And I have this in your slide notes, but the hazard ratio for overweight individuals is a 0.94, and this is pretty typical across studies. So I have several listed in your slide notes. But across studies, what we see is that actually overweight is associated with a decreased risk of mortality, an overweight BMI. So not a huge reduction in risk, but something like a 4 to a 9% reduction in risk. And you see that in this data here. So this is what we would consider a U or a J-shaped dose response relationship. So, right, as we get away from one, we do see increased risk. And as we get away from one, my reference group here, we also see increased risk. So that's a J or a U-shaped dose response relationship here. With that low point actually happening, right? Below here, it looks like 22.5. With men, though, actually, we're pretty squarely lowest risk. It looks like we're looking at like a 27 BMI. Okay, and that's squarely in the overweight category. Also, what's interesting here, when we're looking at all subjects, sorry, there are two lines here. So we have healthy subjects who have never smoked. If we're looking at all subjects, we actually see greater risk for mortality in underweight individuals as compared to severely obese individuals. So across studies, hazard ratios look like they're about 1.5. In this particular study, which adjusted for age, physical activity, alcohol consumption, education, and marital status, we see actually higher risk with these lower BMI values, and underweight is considered less than 18.5. So some of the risks of being underweight, which we're not going to go into too much in this lecture, just because this lecture is about obesity, and that's not obesity, it's just an unhealthy weight. But you do see osteopenia, osteoporosis, fractures, sarcopenia, peripheral edema, cardiac arrhythmias, renal disease, reduced fertility, and death. And across the literature, what I typically see is that death rate is really what we're super concerned about, because it does look like it's actually your risk of death actually goes up higher than what we would see in a severely obese population. So pretty significant risk for mortality. This is just a great figure that shows, right? There are a lot. So I didn't even list them all here, right? But there's a lot of different health outcomes that we don't want, right? We don't want cataracts. We don't want obstructive sleep apnea. And all of those things are associated with obesity. So mortality isn't the only outcome that we're interested in here. The other aspect, so sometimes to get funding for research studies, we highlight what's the cost of obesity. So this study looked at the cost of obesity in children, and what they found was that compared to non-obese children, there was about a $1.32 billion increase in cost for obese children, and that's nationwide. Um, when they when they broke it down though by overweight versus moderate versus severely obese, actually overweight children had a reduced economic impact. So again, sort of similar to what we see in adults, where that overweight piece may be protective actually in some ways. Um, Although it is helpful to note that in children, obesity is diagnosed differently. So obesity is diagnosed as being between the 95th and the 120th percentiles of weight. So it's still using BMI, but it's BMI percentiles as compared to BMI values. So then in adults 20 plus, what they found was that obese compared to non-obese, there was a $172 billion increase in cost across the US. And for underweight individuals, interestingly, looks like a reduction. However, when we look at the confidence interval, right, not statistically significant there. When we look at overweight individuals, significant increase in cost for adults, right? $50 billion, $77 billion for moderate obesity, and then for severe obesity, $126 billion. So overall obesity, right, costing the US a lot of money. And when a researcher tells the government, the NIH or the CDC, hey, obesity is costing the US $172 billion every year, I have this intervention study that I'm interested in. I can help reduce that number, right? Then the government is typically interested in that just from a cost perspective. So this is one thing that researchers will use to solicit funds for their research. So we're talking about obesity and BMI, right? Because that's how obesity is defined. But risk is compounded by the type and location of excess tissue. So one, there is a difference in men and women here, right? So we said there wasn't a difference in BMI, but what there is a difference in is where that tissue is deposited in men and women. So in men, we have what's called an android pattern of fat deposition where men tend to store more fat in their midsection, whereas women tend to store more fat in their lower section. So a gynoid pattern of fat deposition. And this gynoid pattern is considered less dangerous. So, and one way that we measure that is with waist circumference. So this is uh, a weighted tape measure to measure waist circumferences. And what we see is that across the board, if we're looking at, for example, someone who is class 1 obese, right, their risk for a variety of diseases does go up. Even if cost doesn't go up, even if mortality doesn't go up, the risk for a lot of different diseases does go up. And it for individuals who have a normal waist circumference, we have high risk, but for individuals with an abnormal waist circumference, the risk does go up even further, right? So again, sort of looking at where is that tissue deposited and does that make a difference? And in fact, we see that it does. And this is how waist circumference is, right? We see a dose response relationship between risk and waist circumference. So I'm going to just show you some quick data on that. What we see in some of these studies that are looking at waist circumference specifically is that waist circumference and not body mass index explains obesity-related health risks. So this study was looking at a variety of different health outcomes, right? Hypertension, hypercholesterolemia, high LDLs, low LDLs, right? Metabolic syndrome in men and women. And in this partially adjusted model, which doesn't account for waist circumference, right, we see that, well, the risk for hypertension is, in this case, 75% higher for men compared to healthy weight men. However, in the fully adjusted model, they adjusted for waist circumference. So if we look at this little number 4 and come down to here, they adjusted for waist circumference here as a continuous variable. And so then now we're looking at this confidence interval. So it still says there's an 11% increased risk. However, that confidence interval doesn't, or it crosses 1, right? So actually, there's no significant increase in risk if you adjust for waist circumference. So these individuals still had high BMIs, right? But it was the waist circumference that really seemed to be making a difference. And that, if you follow these columns down, you see that pattern across both. Oh, sorry, this was in overweight subjects, but we see the same pattern in obese subjects. So, right, really significant risk in obese subjects compared to normal weight subjects for hypertension. So, 199% increased risk in class 1 obese subjects for hypertension. But when we control for waist circumference, now no significant difference between class 1 obese subjects and normal weight subjects in their risk for hypertension. So it looks like waist circumference is to blame for that change. So when we then compare BMI and waist circumference side by side, so this is uh, BMI controlling for waist circumference, and this is waist circumference controlling for BMI. So if we're just looking at BMI, most of these show no significant change in risk, right? But for waist circumference, right, we still see a 3% increased risk for hypertension, 2% increased risk for hypercholesterolemia, 5% increased risk for low HDL cholesterol, right? So, right here we're saying, okay, uh, waist circumference explains the obesity related health risks and that when we compare the two waist circumferences, the better predictor. So really quickly, just on composition of weight, right? So I wanted to look at FM is fat mass, FFM is fat-free mass, and then the obesity paradox. So this is in individuals who were, this study was done in individuals who were um, referred for cardiac rehab. Sorry, I could not think of the word referred. And we're looking at 3-year mortality risk. Okay, so mortality risk for the low body fat and low lean mass was the greatest. Okay, so people who already have disease, essentially, right? If they had low body fat and low lean mass, that's going to significantly decrease their risk for survival. Okay. What's interesting though about this study is, and right related to the obesity paradox in particular, is that those with high body fat and high lean mass had the lowest risk. Okay. So, and that's even compared to individuals who had low body fat and high lean mass. Okay, so just total mass, having more mass, including fat mass, is protective for individuals who have already been diagnosed with disease, which is why we might see that, especially for class 1 obesity, right? We don't see increased mortality risk in older populations because those older populations are also more than likely have been diagnosed with a chronic disease, right? And if they've already been diagnosed with a chronic disease, actually, that extra tissue may be protective against mortality specifically. All right, we're going to take a little break here before coming back to talk about etiology, development, and pathophysiology.